An employee was cleaning the Ruthless CEO's office until he locked the door and confessed his love. "Hello, my beautiful souls, my lovely family. Welcome with all my heart to this space filled with love, imagination, and stories from deep within my soul. Today, I'm humbly asking for your support for Alcott's Stories channel. Every story you see here is written by me. They carry my heart, my thoughts, and my dreams. If you love me, if you believe in me, if you trust my words, then please watch these stories, and especially the ones told by our beloved Mr. Alcott Bryan, all the way till the end. To all my sweet family who haven't yet subscribed, please hit that subscribe button now. Show your love, show your faith. Let's grow this beautiful journey together. And one more thing. If you ever feel like Mr. Alcott Bryan's voice isn't for you, just drop a comment below. I'm here to make sure your experience is magical, I promise. I'll find a new storyteller who touches your heart even more. So with that said, over to you, Mr. Alcott Bryan.
Hello and welcome, my lovely and sweet family, to Alcott Stories. I am your storyteller, Alcott Bryan, and tonight I bring you a love story that will strike you like a current, sharp, beautiful, unforgettable. This isn't just a story, it's a journey through tension, desire, and soul-deep connection. A tale of two people from different worlds, colliding, breaking rules, and finding something far greater than power or beauty, truthful love. I request you, from the bottom of my heart, don't skip a moment. If you leave, even for a second, you'll miss the storm, you'll miss the fire, and most of all, you'll miss 3 nights of the most unforgettable romance ever told. So sit back, breathe deep, and let me take you into the world of Zaria and Lucien. The elevator chimed on the 58th floor, its doors sliding open to reveal polished obsidian tiles that gleamed beneath cold, white lights. Zaria stepped out cautiously, adjusting the strap on her cleaning cart, the scent of lemon disinfectant rising from the supplies. Her heart thudded a little louder than usual. She had never been assigned to this floor before. The top level of Voss Corporation, everyone knew what it meant. Lucien Voss's domain. No one lingered there. The space was almost mythical among the janitorial staff, cold, untouched, off limits. She walked slowly, wheels squeaking with every turn of her cart as she followed the golden plaque that read Executive Office, L. Voss. Zaria paused before the grand double doors. Her brown eyes flickered across the handles, as if half expecting them to be electrified. She took a slow breath. It was probably empty. No billionaire CEO worked this late. She pushed the door open. The scent hit her first. Clean leather, cedarwood, and the faintest whisper of expensive cologne. The office was massive, floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 walls, revealing the glittering skyline of the city at night. Sleek bookshelves, glass tables, and a massive desk positioned like a throne. And in the high-backed chair behind it, a figure sat unmoving. Lucien Voss. Zaria froze. He was turned slightly away, one arm resting on the desk, the other elbow propped as he held a glass of scotch lazily between his fingers. The skyline's glow etched the sharp angles of his face, strong jaw, high cheekbones, midnight black hair falling just above his collar. His blue eyes shifted slightly and landed on her. Time stilled. Zaria's breath caught. Her instinct screamed to apologize, to retreat, but she couldn't speak. She stood there, motionless, like a deer caught beneath cathedral light. His gaze didn't waver. It wasn't angry. It wasn't surprised. It was something else, calculating, distant, but caught. Finally he spoke, voice deep and quiet. You're not who usually cleans this floor. Zarya nodded, managing her voice. I was told to fill in. I didn't know you were still here. I can come back later. Lucien Voss swirled the amber in his glass and leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. No need. Do your work. He didn't look away. Zarya rolled her cart in slowly, her body tense with awareness. She pulled out a cloth and cleaner, pretending not to notice him watching her as she approached the glass-top table near the windows. The office was unnervingly silent. Every spray of the bottle, every wipe of the cloth felt amplified. She focused on her task, dusting, wiping, straightening decorative items she dared not touch. Yet she felt the heat of his gaze tracing her movements, the curve of her waist as she bent, the sway of her hips as she crossed the floor. She turned slightly, stealing a glance. He was still watching. Unapologetically. Zarya's pulse raced, but she kept moving, sweeping the duster along the edge of his bookshelf. Leather-bound volumes lined the shelves, flanked by abstract sculptures that hinted at wealth far beyond comprehension. She paused at a painting, the only splash of color in the monochrome room. An abstract female figure, faceless, elegant. You like it? He asked. She turned. It's different. Lucien stood slowly, placing his glass down. His movements were precise, unhurried, like he was used to people adjusting to his pace. He walked toward her, his footsteps a soft echo against marble. She's faceless, because the artist believed beauty didn't need identity, he said, his voice close now. It just needed presence. Zarya swallowed. I think beauty is more powerful when it has identity. Lucien's gaze sharpened slightly. Do you? She nodded, folding the duster in her hands to keep them from trembling. Otherwise, it's just an image, like a mannequin. A beat of silence passed. Then he smiled, not a full smile, but the ghost of something rarely shown. It flickered and vanished. He stepped back, giving her space. I'm rarely challenged. I wasn't challenging you, just answering. He watched her a moment longer, then returned to his desk. Zarya resumed cleaning, every nerve alight. Her skin buzzed from the tension in the room, not hostile, but electric. She had never been seen like that before, not by someone so powerful, so untouchable. Minutes passed. She moved to the large windows, spraying the glass and wiping in slow circles. Behind her, she heard the rustle of papers, the creak of his chair. She felt the weight of his eyes again, sliding across her back, down the curve of her hips. Her breath quickened. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was charged. She finished the windows and moved to the side tables, her hands steady, but her thoughts spinning. Lucien stood again. He walked to a nearby shelf and picked up a book, flipping it open. What's your name? He asked without looking up. Zarya. Zarya, he repeated, tasting the syllables. It suits you. She paused. Thank you, Mr. Voss. He looked up. Lucien. She turned to face him. Excuse me? Call me Lucien, just for tonight. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He gave no explanation. Just a look, piercing, enigmatic. Then he returned to his desk and sat, resting his hands together beneath his chin. The clock ticked. Zarya finished the last surface, placed her supplies back on the cart, and turned toward the door. Good night, Lucien, she said, her voice quiet. He didn't respond immediately, but just as she reached for the door, his voice followed her. Come back tomorrow. Clean this floor again. Zarya paused, heart pounding. Is that a request or an order? Another silence. Then, It's an opportunity. She didn't turn around. She pushed the cart through the doors, leaving the office behind, but not the weight of his stare. As the elevator descended, her reflection stared back at her in the mirrored walls. Something had changed. A door had opened. Not just in the office, but somewhere much deeper. And Zarya wasn't sure if she'd walk back through it or be pulled. The days following Zarya's first encounter with Lucien Voss passed with a strange weight that clung to the air. It wasn't just the office she cleaned, or the endless floors she dusted and polished. It was the top floor, the space where Lucien ruled, where she now knew he lingered, unseen, yet deeply felt. Zarya had returned the next night to clean the same floor, and the next. Each time, Lucien was there, though he rarely spoke. He watched her like a predator watches its prey, distant, careful, but intent. His eyes, so cold and sharp, were the only thing she could never quite escape. She felt them even when he wasn't in the room. It was early in the evening when she noticed it. His usual silence was now interrupted by a murmur of curiosity. "What do you like to do when you're not cleaning?" Zarya paused mid-swipe of the desk, her heart skipping. She hadn't expected him to speak first. "Excuse me?" Lucien leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping on the edge of his desk. His posture was casual, but his gaze was laser-focused. His blue eyes were studying her, calculating as if he were a master detective trying to solve a puzzle that was just out of reach. "What do you do for fun?" he asked again, the question simpler now, but laced with something unspoken, a need to know more. Zarya set down the cloth, slightly stunned by the question. She had always kept her personal life private. It was safer that way, easier to remain invisible. "I paint," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Mostly at night. It's something I've done for a long time." Lucien's interest seemed piqued, and his eyes never left her face. "Paint? What do you paint?" Zarya shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable under his unrelenting gaze. "Anything, really. It's just a way to escape." There was a long silence, but Lucien seemed content to let it stretch. His eyes lingered on her, drinking in every detail. The way her lips parted as she spoke, the quiet fire in her brown eyes. Something in her voice had caught his attention, something he hadn't expected. "You paint to escape," Lucien repeated, his voice deep. He seemed to weigh the words, turning them over in his mind. "That's interesting." Zarya shifted uncomfortably, returning to her work. She felt his gaze on her like a physical touch, leaving an ache between her shoulders. "Everyone has their ways of escaping." Lucien didn't respond, but the silence between them now felt charged, different from before. He was still there, watching her, but for the first time, there was a hint of something. Softer. Curiosity? Maybe. But that was all it was, right? He was just a man with too much time and too much power, playing with the lives of those around him. Over the next few nights, Lucien's questions grew more personal. Each time, Zarya tried to avoid them, but each time, his blue eyes followed her every move, forcing her to answer, even when she didn't want to. They were simple questions about her family, her likes and dislikes, what brought her joy. Yet, no matter how personal they seemed, they never felt like small talk. It was more as if he was gathering information, pieces of a puzzle he was trying to complete. One night, she was dusting the corner bookshelves, a book in her hands, when his voice sliced through the silence. "Tell me about your little brother." Zarya's heart squeezed. She hadn't spoken about him, not to anyone in a long time. Not even her closest friends knew how much she sacrificed for her younger brother, Elijah. The questions came at her from all sides, and she found herself answering before she could stop. His name is Elijah. He's 9. I take care of him. He's my responsibility now. Our parents, they passed away a few years ago. Lucien's gaze softened, if only for a brief moment. There was an edge of understanding in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with his usual stoic composure. "What's it like?" he asked quietly. "Being responsible for someone else's life?" Zarya looked up from her work. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something she couldn't place. Something deeper. Something personal. "It's not easy," she admitted, setting the book back in place. "But it's worth it. I wouldn't trade it for anything." Lucien's gaze lingered on her, but he didn't speak again. The question seemed to hang in the air, unresolved, as if he were contemplating the weight of responsibility himself. Zarya returned to her work, but now her movements felt more self-conscious. Each step she took, each swipe of the cloth, was filled with an awareness she hadn't felt before. She could feel him watching her, the intensity of his stare burning into the back of her neck. The silence stretched, but this time Zarya couldn't ignore the pull of his presence. There was something magnetic about him, something dangerous. She had to fight the urge to glance at him, to look into those icy blue eyes that seemed to see through her. It was like he knew her better than anyone had ever even bothered to try. As she worked, Zarya's thoughts wandered. She had told herself she wouldn't get involved with someone like him, someone as cold and unreachable as Lucien Voss. But the more she saw him, the more she heard his questions, the more she realized she didn't know where the lines were anymore. What was he looking for? And what did it mean that he was asking about her life? His presence was a constant now, a shadow that followed her through the halls of the office long after the workday had ended. She tried to dismiss it, tried to tell herself it didn't matter. But deep down, she knew it did. And it was only just beginning to consume her. And then one evening, as she reached the final stage of the cleaning, she caught his gaze again. This time, he didn't look away. Zarya's heart skipped, and she froze, not knowing what to say. "Tell me something," Lucien spoke suddenly, his voice low. "What's the one thing you want more than anything in the world?" Zarya didn't answer immediately. Her throat tightened. It was an impossible question. What did she want more than anything? To feel safe again? To have a life that didn't feel like it was constantly slipping away? But she couldn't answer that. She couldn't let him see the cracks in her armor. She stopped, taking a steadying breath. "I want things to be better for Elijah. That's all I've ever wanted." Lucien didn't respond right away. He simply watched her, those blue eyes of his studying her with an intensity that felt suffocating. Zarya wasn't sure if it was admiration or something else entirely, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. For a long moment, it was just the two of them, the sound of her cleaning supplies, the faint hum of the city outside the windows, and the silence of his gaze. Finally, Lucien spoke. "I'll make sure he gets the best education." Zarya blinked. "What?" "Elijah," Lucien said, his voice more certain now. "If you need help, I'll make sure he gets the best." Zarya's chest tightened. Her voice caught in her throat. "Why would you do that?" Lucien's gaze didn't falter. "Because you asked for it." Her pulse raced. She didn't know what to say, what to feel. And then Lucien's gaze flickered to her lips before returning to her eyes. For a second, Zarya thought he might move closer. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Lucien turned away and sat back down at his desk, never looking back. Zarya stood there, her heart still racing, unsure of what had just happened. All she knew was that his eyes, those blue eyes, would haunt her long after she left the office. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she could escape. Zarya had always prided herself on being invisible in the corporate world. She didn't crave attention, nor did she expect it. Her job was simple, a quiet task in the background of the high-rise, cleaning the office floors, ensuring everything was in its place. The city buzzed around her, but she was used to being unseen, unnoticed. But everything had changed in the last few days. The moments with Lucien Voss, his questions, the way he studied her with his piercing blue eyes, had turned the quiet space of the office into a battleground for emotions she didn't know how to deal with. Zarya had tried to avoid him, kept her distance, but fate had other plans. It happened one evening as she left the elevator to make her way to the top floor. She had been lost in her thoughts, mentally rehearsing the evening's tasks when it occurred. A soft chime echoed in the hall, the doors of the elevator sliding open just as she reached the corner. Lucien. He stepped out of the elevator, a tall figure of power and poise, his tailored suit sharp against the smooth lines of his body. Zarya froze for a second, the familiar ache in her chest returning with his mere presence. She stepped back to make room, but in that split second, the strap of her bag slipped from her shoulder. The bag tumbled, hitting the polished marble floor with a soft thud. Without missing a beat, Lucien bent down. Zarya felt the air around her tighten as he reached for her bag. His hand brushed against hers, sending an unexpected jolt of electricity through her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Their eyes locked, and Zarya felt the familiar pull of his gaze. His blue eyes seemed to pierce through her, deeper than usual. There was an intensity there, something she couldn't quite explain. Their fingers lingered, just for a moment longer than necessary. Time stretched between them, suspended in the shared touch. Lucien didn't pull away immediately. His hand hovered over hers, just inches from her skin. The heat from his touch seemed to spread through her body like a fire she couldn't control. Zarya's breath caught in her throat, and she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to look away from his eyes. It was as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. No office, no work, no elevator. Just the press of his hand against hers, the shared moment between them that didn't make sense. Then, as if coming to his senses, Lucien straightened up. He handed her the bag with a slight, almost imperceptible smile, his blue eyes still watching her closely. "Thank you," Zarya said quietly, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. She took the bag from him, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. Lucien's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he nodded and turned to walk away. Zarya stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. What had just happened? Her fingers still tingled where he had touched her, and her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. She should have walked away, gone back to her cleaning duties, but her legs felt heavy, like they had been rooted to the floor. She shook her head, trying to clear the confusion. It was just a touch, she told herself. Nothing more. Lucien was Lucien Voss, and she was just Zarya, a woman who cleaned his office. Nothing would ever come of it. But as she turned towards the elevator, the sensation of his touch remained, a lingering reminder of something she didn't fully understand. The next few days passed in a haze. Zarya tried to focus on her work, tried to avoid the pull she felt every time Lucien was near. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was always watching. His presence seemed to follow her wherever she went, across the polished floors, past the glass walls, in every silent space they shared. And it wasn't just his gaze. It was the way he seemed to be looking at her differently now. Like she wasn't just the woman who cleaned his office, but something more. His eyes lingered longer, his questions more probing, his attention more intense. Zarya couldn't explain it. Why would someone like Lucien Voss, cold, unapproachable, driven by power and wealth, notice her? What was it about her that had made him stop and pay attention? She wasn't like the women he usually surrounded himself with. Polished, glamorous, carefully curated. She was real, raw. She had never been glamorous, never tried to be. And yet she could feel it, that unpull between them. It was as if something in her had awakened in his presence, a power she had long buried, hidden beneath the need to stay invisible, to stay unnoticed. But now, every glance from Lucien felt like a spark, an invitation to something dangerous. The more he looked at her, the more she felt drawn in. She tried to push it away, tried to convince herself it didn't matter. After all, she had a life to focus on, a little brother who needed her. She didn't have time for games, especially not with someone like Lucien. But the next time she found herself alone with him in his office, it was different. Lucien didn't speak immediately, but his gaze followed her with that same intensity, that unspoken challenge. He didn't say anything, but his eyes did all the talking. They pinned her to the spot, trapping her in his gaze, making her feel like she was the only one in the room. Zarya tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. She had spent so many years trying to fade into the background, to remain unnoticed, but now she was feeling something else entirely. A power, a presence that came from his gaze, his attention. And it terrified her. Every time their eyes met, something shifted within her, a crack in the armor she had so carefully built around herself. She was afraid of what that might mean, afraid of what Lucien might be awakening in her. But no matter how hard she tried to fight it, Zarya couldn't escape it. His gaze had already found her, and now she wasn't sure if she wanted to hide anymore. The questions kept coming, small at first, but they built on each other, layer by layer. Lucien didn't seem content to let her remain the enigma she had always been. He wanted to know more about her life, her passions, her dreams, and Zarya found herself, despite everything, wanting to answer him. For the first time in a long while, she wanted to be seen. It was one of those mornings when Zarya felt more out of place than usual. The morning sunlight poured through the large windows of the office building, but the warmth of the day didn't reach the tension that had been quietly building between her and Lucien. He hadn't been as distant lately, but it didn't make the atmosphere any easier to navigate. The weight of his gaze still lingered, and Zarya was unsure how to handle it. Today, she was called to his office to help his assistant, Lila, set up coffee. It wasn't the kind of task she usually did, but Lila had been in a rush, and Zarya was glad for the distraction. The task, however, wasn't as easy as it seemed. She entered the large, sleek office, the coffee cart already set up by the far wall. The fragrance of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a rich scent that seemed almost out of place against the polished sophistication of the space. Lucien sat behind his desk, the same stoic expression on his face as always. His eyes flickered over to her when she walked in, a silent acknowledgement. But he didn't say anything. Lila quickly handed her a tray with 2 coffee mugs, napkins, and a carafe. "Can you just pour the coffee, please?" she asked, her tone light. Zarya nodded, setting the tray down on the side table as she moved towards the coffee station. Her hands were slightly shaky as she grabbed the carafe and poured the coffee into the first mug. She was still getting used to the idea of being in Lucien's presence so often. It wasn't that he ever said much, he rarely spoke directly to her. But there was always this underlying tension. The way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way his eyes lingered longer than necessary. Just as she reached for the second mug, her hand brushed against the side of the coffee pot, causing it to tilt precariously. She couldn't stop the spill. Hot coffee splashed across the polished wood of the desk, some of it spilling onto the papers scattered there. Her heart sank as she watched the dark liquid spread across the surface. Lucien's gaze snapped to her immediately. His icy blue eyes narrowed, but instead of the anger she expected, he simply sighed deeply. He didn't shout or chastise her, nothing like that. Instead, he stood from behind his desk with a controlled grace that startled Zarya. Before she could even react, Lucien was there, kneeling in front of her. He grabbed a napkin from the desk and began dabbing at the coffee stains. Zarya felt a rush of heat rush to her cheeks. Her hands froze mid-air as she watched him, the proximity between them enough to leave her breathless. For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. All that existed was the space between them, the scent of coffee, the warmth of his body so close to hers. His fingers brushed hers as they both reached for the same napkin, the electricity between them undeniable. Zarya quickly pulled her hand away, her heartbeat racing. "I'm so sorry," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to—" "It's fine," Lucien interrupted, his voice steady, but softer than usual. His eyes met hers for a brief second, and something in them made her throat tighten. There was no anger in his gaze. Instead, it was something different. Something that Zarya couldn't quite put her finger on. He didn't pull away, didn't chastise her like she had expected. Instead, he remained there, helping her clean up the mess. Their movements were synchronized, quiet, the space around them filled with the sound of napkins dabbing at the coffee stains. Zarya wasn't sure how to feel. There was something so intimate about the moment. Her heart pounded in her chest, her nerves on edge. She had never seen this side of Lucien before, this unguarded version of him. It didn't match the ice-cold CEO she had always known. It was like a fleeting glimpse into a part of him that he rarely showed. When the desk was cleaned, Lucien stood up, towering over her once again. There was no judgment in his expression, just understanding? Zarya couldn't be sure. All she knew was that her body felt too aware of his presence, the space between them charged in a way that left her breathless. He took a step back and folded his arms. The air between them felt thicker than before, like something unspoken had passed between them. Zarya couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She had spilled coffee, and yet it felt like everything else in the world had shifted too. "You're not like the others," Lucien said, his voice low, and to her surprise, there was no mockery in it, only the slightest edge of sincerity. Zaria's brow furrowed, unsure of how to respond. Was he talking about her clumsiness, her awkwardness, her presence? She couldn't be sure. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice betraying the vulnerability she had been trying to hide. Lucien's eyes held hers, steady and intense. "You don't pretend," he said quietly. "Not like the others." Zaria couldn't help herself. A laugh escaped her lips, the sound almost bitter. "Because I spill things," she joked, trying to diffuse the tension that hung in the air. Lucien didn't laugh. He didn't even crack a smile. Instead, he held her gaze with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you don't pretend to be something you're not." The words hung in the air, a weight that Zaria couldn't escape. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure what to do with the compliment. Or was it a compliment? What did Lucien mean by that? But instead of answering, she simply nodded, unsure of what else to do. Lucien's eyes lingered on her for one more moment before he turned away, returning to his desk and resuming his usual cold demeanor. But Zaria couldn't shake the feeling that this interaction, this brief, seemingly insignificant moment, had shifted something between them. And though she tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than an accident, she couldn't deny the truth that had settled deep inside her. She was no longer invisible to him. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the entire building plunged into darkness. Zaria froze for a moment, her heart skipping a beat as the sudden stillness enveloped the space. She had been on her way back from the top floor after finishing her duties, her arms laden with cleaning supplies when it happened. The elevator doors had just closed behind her when the building went dark. She sighed, resigned. Another power outage. Just her luck. She reached for the emergency button, her fingers pressing the cold metal as the hum of the elevator went silent. She glanced at the small emergency light above the door, casting an eerie, dim glow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her realize she wasn't alone. Lucien. He was there, standing across from her, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. His presence filled the small, confined space of the elevator, and Zaria could feel the tension between them immediately. She hadn't expected to see him. Of course, she hadn't expected to be trapped in an elevator with him either. For a long moment, they stood in silence. The kind of silence that was never truly empty, the kind that spoke volumes without a word being exchanged. The silence between them was thick, like an unspoken conversation. Zaria shifted nervously, trying to calm the beat of her heart. She hadn't expected this. Being alone with him, in the dark, in such close proximity. She could feel the space between them shrinking with every passing second. Lucien, however, didn't seem fazed by the situation. He stood with his usual poise, but Zaria could sense a subtle tension in the way his shoulders were drawn, the way his jaw clenched. She couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. The seconds stretched, stretching into what felt like hours. The faint buzzing of the emergency light was the only sound that filled the silence, along with the soft, uneven rhythm of their breathing. Zaria tried to focus on anything but him. The small scratches on the floor, the metal walls, anything to distract herself from the heavy weight of his gaze. But she couldn't. Finally, Lucien broke the silence, his voice a low murmur in the otherwise still air. "I've been in this situation before," he said, his words almost casual, but there was a depth to them, except it wasn't the lights that went out. His voice held a strange undertone, one that she couldn't quite place. Zarya glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly in curiosity. But she didn't respond. She simply waited for him to continue. Lucien exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the faint outline of her face in the dim light. It was the world. It was the expectations, the pressure. Everyone constantly watching, waiting for you to fail. He paused for a moment, his voice trailing off before he spoke again. "Beauty is currency in my world, Zarya. It's the one thing that people see and value. But it's never enough. No one ever really cares about what lies beneath the surface." His tone shifted, hardening with the weight of his words. Zarya felt a strange tightness in her chest, something akin to empathy. But it was more than that. It was understanding. She didn't know his pain, but in the stillness of the elevator, in the rawness of his words, she could feel something real and raw in him. "And you think it's different for me?" Zarya asked quietly, breaking her silence. Her voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability she couldn't hide. Lucien turned to face her more fully, his gaze intense. "Yes," he said simply. Zarya swallowed, the words cutting through her like a knife. She had always known that she was different in this world, that she didn't fit into the polished image Lucien and his kind had built around themselves. But hearing him say it, so plainly, so coldly, hit her harder than she expected. Before she could say anything, Lucien took a step toward her, his movements slow but deliberate. He was right in front of her now, so close she could feel the warmth of his body. His gaze never left hers, and for the first time, Zarya saw something in his eyes that wasn't masked by the impenetrable walls he had so carefully built around himself. "You don't belong," he repeated, but this time his voice was softer, almost regretful. "But I can't stop thinking about you, and that terrifies me." Zarya's breath hitched in her throat. There it was, the admission, the crack in his armor. Lucien was the kind of man who had everything, wealth, power, status, and yet he was telling her he couldn't stop thinking about her. A woman who worked as a janitor, a woman who didn't belong. Her heart raced in her chest, and for a split second, she didn't know what to do with the raw vulnerability hanging in the air between them. The space was charged, crackling with unspoken feelings, but Zarya couldn't deny the way her body responded to him. The moments dragged on, heavy with anticipation. Her fingers tingled, and Zarya found herself drawn to him despite herself. She tried to maintain control, but her pulse raced, her breath shallow. She could feel his presence, his energy, his confusion, all surrounding her. And for the first time, she didn't want to run from it. Lucien's gaze dropped to her hand, which had clenched slightly at her side, and his eyes flicked back to hers. He reached for her, the movement slow but sure, and Zarya's breath caught. His hand hovered for a moment, and then, without thinking, she let it happen. His fingers brushed against hers, and the sensation was electric. The touch was tentative at first, unsure, but when Zarya didn't pull away, he closed the gap, holding her hand firmly in his. The connection was intense, powerful, as though everything else in the world had faded away. All that remained was the press of his hand against hers and the electricity coursing through her veins. The moment stretched on, both of them locked in that brief connection, unsure of where it would lead, but unable to stop. In that dark, quiet elevator, Zarya felt more alive than she had in years. And Lucien, the man who had spent his life building walls around his heart, seemed to be tearing them down piece by piece. And neither of them knew how to stop. The building was empty when Zarya returned to the top floor that night. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead echoed in the empty hallways as she pushed her cleaning cart through the polished floors. The usual quiet of the late hours had settled in. She was finishing her shift, her mind occupied with the usual routine, when something unusual stopped her. The music, soft, soulful jazz, the kind that wrapped around you like velvet, filled the air. The unmistakable sounds of John Coltrane drifted from Lucien's office, a sound she hadn't expected to hear. The melody was slow, intimate, the kind of music that seemed to carry emotions without saying a word. Zarya paused in the hallway, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what she was hearing. Curiosity tugged at her, and against her better judgment, she moved toward his office. She hesitated at the door, her fingers brushing against the cold metal handle. She had heard the music before, but never so late, never with this kind of quiet invitation behind it. When she pushed the door open, Lucien looked up from his desk. He was sitting in the low light of his office, a glass of water in his hand, a relaxed, almost uncharacteristic expression on his face. He wasn't the CEO she had come to know, the sharp, controlling figure who commanded attention. This Lucien seemed different, less guarded, more human. He smiled when he saw her standing in the doorway, uncertainty written in his posture. "I didn't think you'd still be here," he said, his voice soft, the edges of his usual cold tone smoothed by the music. "Come in." Zarya stood frozen for a moment, caught in the pull of his gaze. She almost turned to leave, to return to her usual duties, but something about the invitation in his voice made her take a tentative step forward. She entered, closing the door behind her, the sound of the music filling the small space between them. "You don't usually play music like this," Zarya said, trying to ease the tension that had crept up in her chest. Her voice was calm, but inside her heart was racing. Lucien chuckled softly, the sound rare and genuine. "I don't usually," he admitted. "But sometimes the silence is too much. I needed something different tonight." Zarya glanced around the office, noting the subtle change in atmosphere. The dim lighting made everything feel softer, warmer. The sleek, modern office felt more like a personal space, and for the first time she saw Lucien in a different light. He was still impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, but there was a weariness to him now, a tiredness that wasn't usually there. He set the glass down on the desk and stood, walking over to where Zarya was standing near the door. His gaze shifted to the glass of water on the desk, but when he looked back at her, there was a kind of sincerity in his eyes. "Would you like a drink? Something to relax?" His tone was casual, but there was an underlying tension. She could sense that he was still working through whatever was on his mind. But the invitation was real. "I don't drink alcohol," Zarya responded, her voice low. She didn't know why she felt the need to clarify, but something about this moment, the softness of the music, the vulnerability in his eyes, made her feel more open than she had before. Lucien nodded, as if he understood, and reached for another glass from the nearby cabinet. He filled it with water and handed it to her, with a small smile. Non-alcoholic, he teased, his voice light. She accepted it, their fingers brushing briefly, sending a jolt through her. She took a small sip, the coolness of the water soothing the heat that had begun to rise in her cheeks. "Tell me something," Lucien said suddenly, the change in his voice drawing her attention. He was standing closer now, the air between them thick with unspoken words. "What do you dream about, Zarya? What do you want?" She blinked, surprised by the question. She had never expected him to ask her something so personal, so raw. He had never been one to pry into her life before, always maintaining that cold, distant persona. But tonight, in the quiet of his office, with only the music and the dim light between them, something had shifted. Zarya hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I dream about a life where I can be free," she said slowly, her voice more vulnerable than she meant it to be. "A life where I don't have to hide, where I'm not just a background character, but someone who's seen." Lucien's eyes softened, something flickering in his gaze as he stepped closer, a subtle shift that closed the distance between them. "I know what that's like," he murmured. "Everyone wants something to prove. Everyone wants to matter. But sometimes the harder we try to be seen, the more invisible we become." Her heart tightened at his words, a connection forming between them that went beyond the surface. He was no longer the untouchable CEO, the man she was afraid to even look at. In this moment, he was just a man, with his own struggles, his own fears. And Zarya, she understood those fears. Before she could speak again, Lucien took a step back, his gaze turning inward as if he were lost in his thoughts. The music swirled around them, the quiet swish of the saxophone, creating an intimate backdrop to the fragile moment they were sharing. Then, to Zarya's surprise, Lucien extended his hand toward her. "Dance with me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just for a moment." Zarya blinked in shock, uncertain of what to say. The request felt surreal. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared herself for this sudden shift in the energy between them. He wasn't just the CEO anymore. He was something else entirely, someone she could no longer fully categorize or understand. But the moment stretched on, and she found herself reaching out. Her fingers touched his, the warmth of his skin sending a shiver down her spine. He led her into the center of the office, the music still playing softly around them. Their bodies swayed gently, the rhythm slow and measured, just like the heartbeat of the moment. His hand found her waist, and she placed hers on his shoulder, the space between them intimate but not overwhelming. They moved together, the world outside the office melting away. It was like they had entered a different realm, one where words were unnecessary, and their connection spoke louder than anything they could say. She could feel the heat of his body through the fabric of their clothes. She could feel his breath on her neck, the tension between them electric. Their bodies moved in time with the music, close, too close. The pull of attraction was undeniable. The moment stretched, the silence of the room broken only by the soft shuffle of their feet on the polished floor. And then, just as she thought they might kiss, just as she thought she might give in to the magnetic force between them, Lucien pulled back, his face conflicted. His hand left her waist, and the spell between them shattered in an instant. Zarya stood there, breathless, confused. Her pulse raced, her body still humming from the closeness. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to react. Lucien didn't say anything either. His eyes were distant now. A wall reformed between them. "I should go," Zarya said, her voice unsteady. She turned away quickly, her breath catching in her throat. The door to the office seemed so far away now, but she needed to leave. She needed to understand what had just happened, what had changed between them. As she left, the sound of the jazz still echoed in her mind, the soft saxophone playing like a distant memory. A reminder of the night they had almost crossed a line neither of them was ready for. Zarya had just stepped into the office, her feet echoing against the polished floors, when the sound of the door clicking shut behind her sent a shiver down her spine. The soft, deliberate sound of the lock turning was unexpected, unnerving. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she turned slowly, her gaze meeting Lucien's. His expression was unreadable, but the way he stood there, watching her with an intensity that seemed to vibrate through the air, made her skin prickle with an awareness she couldn't escape. "Why did you lock it?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and caution. She didn't know what she feared more, the locked door or the man standing just a few feet away. Lucien didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His eyes told her everything. There was a storm in those blue depths, a turmoil she hadn't seen before. Something was breaking inside of him, and it had nothing to do with the physical world around them. His gaze held her, steady and unwavering, like he was trying to see straight through her. He didn't move toward her, didn't try to close the space between them. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected, and yet there was an undeniable magnetic pull between them, tugging harder than ever before. "I can't pretend anymore," Lucien finally said, his voice low and almost broken. His words hung in the air, thick with unsaid things. He was standing perfectly still, his hands at his sides. But there was something in the way he spoke, something vulnerable and raw. Zarya didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure she could even breathe properly. She wanted to step back, to leave, but her feet wouldn't obey. The locked door behind her kept her rooted to the spot, while Lucien stood in front of her, the storm raging in his eyes. "I can't keep pretending that I don't feel this," he continued, his voice tightening, as if the words themselves were a struggle to get out. "I've been fighting it for so long, but every time you look at me, every time you speak, it becomes harder to ignore." His gaze softened, just for a moment, as though a flicker of something tender swept through the storm in his eyes. "You're nothing like the women I'm supposed to be with. You're not a part of my world, Zarya. You don't belong here." Zarya felt the words hit her like a slap to the face, and for a moment her mind raced, her pulse quickened, and a strange, tight sensation crawled up her throat. He was telling her that she didn't belong, that she didn't fit into his world, his life, that she would never be a part of the kind of life he led. But there was more, something deeper. "I don't belong here," Lucien whispered again, his voice barely audible. "But that doesn't stop me from wanting you. I've tried to bury it. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't anymore. I need you to know. I can't keep pretending like you don't matter." Zarya's breath caught in her chest. His words were a confession, heavy with guilt and desire. She could see it in his eyes, the battle raging inside him, his desire for her, and the disgust he felt for it, as if she were a weakness he could never afford. His next words fell like a hammer on her heart. "I know I shouldn't want you. I know you're from a different world. But when I look at you, it's like nothing else matters. I can't stop myself, Zarya. I can't stop thinking about you. And that scares me more than anything." Zarya's mind was spinning. She was trapped in the moment, unable to escape, her heart pounding in her chest. This man, the powerful, calculating Lucien Voss, was standing in front of her, vulnerable and broken, confessing his feelings. But why now? Why after everything? Why when he had built walls so high, so impenetrable, to keep her out? And then, just as quickly as the confession came, Lucien turned away from her. He walked back toward his desk, his footsteps steady, but there was a weight to his movements, a finality. His back was to her now, but she could still see the rigid tension in his posture, the tightness in his shoulders, as though he was bracing for something. "If you hate me now," he said, his voice eerily calm, "I'll fire myself before I fire you." The words cut through the air like a blade, sharp and raw. He wasn't looking at her as he said them, his gaze fixed on the view of the city skyline outside the window, as if he couldn't bear to face her after what he'd just said. Zarya stood still, her mind reeling. The weight of his confession hung in the air between them, suffocating, and she could barely find the breath to respond. His words had left her speechless. They echoed in her mind, reverberating like a chorus she couldn't escape. Did she hate him? Was it possible for her to hate him after everything they'd shared? The glances, the touches, the slow build of something she wasn't sure how to define? She didn't hate him. Not at all. But she couldn't deny the conflict rising inside of her, the confusion, the pain. This man, the man she had started to feel for, was telling her that he could never fully have her, that she was a complication he couldn't afford, and still he couldn't stop wanting her. Her heart ached for him. She saw the damage, the battle inside him, the way he was suffocating under the weight of his own desires. But she couldn't stay. Not now. Not like this. Zarya turned toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't look back. She couldn't face the man who had just torn down every wall he'd built, and now stood so painfully exposed before her. With a final glance at the locked door, she pushed it open and stepped into the hallway. The silence that followed was deafening, but it wasn't as suffocating as the storm that still raged in her chest. Her heart was pounding as she walked away from him, every step heavier than the last. She didn't hate him, but the words he had spoken, the emotions he had unleashed, they would haunt her long after she left this place. And maybe, just maybe, they would both have to live with the consequences. Zarya stood in front of his office door again. Same corridor, same shadows curling under the low lights. But tonight, her heartbeat wasn't filled with fear. It was full of fire. Her hand hovered over the handle for a breath. Then she opened it. Lucien looked up from where he stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette caught against the city lights. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He didn't move, didn't blink. But something behind his eyes stirred, hope or panic, she couldn't tell. She stepped in, closed the door behind her, and then, slowly, deliberately, turned the lock. The soft click echoed through the room like a drumbeat. Lucien inhaled sharply, his chest rising beneath the open collar of his shirt. His tie was loose, his jacket was gone. And his expression? Wrecked, as though her return had both saved and shattered him at once. Zarya didn't speak. She didn't need to. She walked forward, her steps soundless, her gaze steady. There was no fear in her now, no confusion, just clarity, just choice. And when she stopped in front of him, She lifted a hand to his chest. Her fingers pressed lightly against his shirt, feeling the rhythm of his heart beneath the fabric. "I couldn't stay away," she whispered. Lucien's jaw tightened. "I didn't expect you to come back. I didn't expect you to wait. I wasn't sure I would." But he had. She saw it in his eyes, in the darkness under them, in the slight tremble of his hand as he lifted it to touch her waist. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, even as he pulled her closer. "But I am." Their mouths were inches apart, their breaths tangled, and when their lips finally met, it wasn't desperate, it was reverent, a surrender of restraint, a slow unraveling. Lucien kissed her like a man who had been parched for years, like he'd forgotten what it meant to want gently. His hands stayed still for the longest time, as though he was afraid to break her. But when Zarya deepened the kiss, moaning softly against his lips, something in him shattered. He cupped her face with trembling hands, moved his mouth over hers with aching hunger. Not possession. Worship. Zarya's fingers slipped under the collar of his shirt, tracing the heat of his skin. She didn't rush, didn't let him. This was not about frenzy. It was about learning. When he unbuttoned her blouse, his eyes never left hers. His touch was slow, deliberate, like he was opening a gift, not taking clothes off a body. She gasped when his lips brushed her shoulder, and he paused. "Too much?" "No," she whispered. "Not enough." They moved toward the couch, every footstep a slow heartbeat. Her shirt fell to the floor. His followed, her bra, his belt. Pieces of armor shed until there was nothing between them but skin and silence. Lucien knelt in front of her, not to beg, not to dominate, but to honor. He kissed the stretch of her waist, the dip of her hip, the swell of her thigh. His hands gripped her like she was real for the first time in his life, like he'd touched only illusion before her. Zarya arched when his lips found her belly, his breath warm. She tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling him up until they were face to face again. "I don't want to be careful," she said. He kissed her again, this time deeper. "I want to be everything you need," he replied. They lay back onto the couch, tangled in each other, the city lights spilling across their skin. Lucien touched her like every curve was holy. He kissed the inside of her wrist, the hollow of her throat, the underside of her breast. Zarya, in turn, traced the scars he carried in silence, the ones not on skin, but in soul. She kissed his temple, whispered against his neck. When she finally pulled him fully into her, it wasn't with urgency. It was surrender. Their bodies moved like music, slow jazz and velvet thunder. Each moan was a confession, each gasp a promise. She clung to him as if he was the first safe thing she'd ever known. And he held her like she was the last true thing he'd ever feel. Time folded in on itself. There were no minutes, no hours, just the warmth of skin, the wet press of kisses, the fierce intimacy of souls undressed. When it was over, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Lucien wrapped his arms around her as they lay there, skin to skin, heart to heart. He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then the pulse in her neck. She sighed into his chest, fingers tracing lazy circles on his stomach. And for the first time in either of their lives, silence felt like a home. "You didn't fire yourself," she murmured against his skin. Lucien smiled, small and broken. "Number you unlocked me instead." She closed her eyes. "Tomorrow won't be easy." "No," he agreed, "but tonight is ours." And in that fragile, perfect moment, Zarya finally believed him. The rain came without warning, sharp, wild, and relentless. A storm cracked the sky open, streaks of lightning carving light across the city skyline. Inside the tower of Voss Corp, the air hung heavy with electricity. Lucien stood in his office again, lights dimmed, fingers clenched around a tumbler of untouched whiskey. He hadn't heard from her since the night before. That night, the one that changed everything. He hadn't planned on seeing her again. Not like that. Not so soon. But the storm outside had nothing on the one brewing in him. A sudden knock, a pause. Then the door creaked open. Zarya stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, rain dripping from her braids, her coat clinging to her skin. Her breath was shallow, chest rising and falling rapidly. She didn't speak. Didn't have to. Lucien dropped the glass. It thudded softly on the carpet. He was in front of her in seconds. The door slammed behind her as their mouths met like magnets, pulling, crashing, claiming. His hands were tangled in her wet braids, hers pulling his shirt from his slacks. No patience this time. No trembling pause. Just hunger. Raw. Bare. Undeniable. "You came back," he whispered between kisses. "You didn't stop me," she gasped. He lifted her into his arms, lips never leaving hers, and carried her across the room, her soaked coat falling behind them like discarded caution. Rain still pelted the windows, but neither of them noticed. They were their own storm now. Lucien pressed her against the wall beside the window, her back arching into him. Their mouths found each other with frenzied urgency, teeth clashing, breaths stolen, tongues tangled. His hands slid beneath her damp shirt, finding skin that burned against his palms despite the cold. "You're freezing," he murmured, pulling back an inch, panting. "Then warm me," she breathed. He did. Clothes came off in fevered pieces, her shirt, his belt, her leggings, his undershirt. Every piece dropped to the floor with the weight of restraint abandoned. When he picked her up again and laid her across the smooth, polished surface of his desk, her eyes locked with his. "You're not supposed to want me," she said, voice shaking. "I don't want anyone else," he answered. Their bodies found each other again, this time harder, wilder. She wrapped her legs around him, hips rising to meet his in a rhythm too primal for words. Their gasps echoed through the office, lost in the thunder outside. He kissed her throat, her collarbone, the space between her breasts, like it was sacred ground. She pulled him closer by the nape of his neck, pressing their foreheads together as their bodies moved like waves crashing in a storm. This wasn't gentle. This was a battle cry, a plea, a promise. His hands cupped her face as he moved within her, and something behind his eyes broke wide open, something scared, something real. "This," he said, panting, his lips brushing her cheek, "this shouldn't be possible." "But it is," she whispered, clinging to him. It wasn't just heat. It wasn't just release. It was need. It was trust. It was a collision of two lives never meant to intersect. As the storm outside peaked, so did they, together. With clenched fists, hoarse cries, and trembling bodies, they unraveled in each other's arms, shattered and whole in the same breath. Lucien collapsed beside her on the desk, his hand still clasped in hers. The city lights flickered against their skin, slick with sweat, breathless with something that didn't have a name yet. For a while, they lay there in silence, hearts slowing. And then, softly, she asked, "What happens when the sun rises?" He stared up at the ceiling, jaw tight. "The world comes back. Will there be room for this in it? I don't know." He turned to her, eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. But I know I'll fight for it. Zarya looked at him, this man who had once lived in ice, now burning for her. She brushed his hair from his eyes, studying him. "You're scared," she said. "So are you." She nodded. "But I'm still here." He kissed her again, slower now, a vow in lips and breath. And though the storm outside raged on, neither of them moved, because the storm inside was louder and far more dangerous. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, but time had no meaning in the quiet that surrounded them. Zarya sat cross-legged on the office couch, wrapped in a soft throw Lucien had retrieved from the cabinet. Her skin still glowed from the warmth of his touch, but her heart was caught in something deeper now, something unfamiliar, intimate. Lucien stood by the window, dressed only in slacks, his shirt abandoned somewhere in the earlier storm of their bodies. He looked different in the low light, younger, unarmored. "You ever get tired of pretending?" he asked quietly, eyes on the city lights. Zarya blinked. "Pretending what?" "That the world makes sense, that you're okay, that the walls you build don't trap you too." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tugged the blanket closer around her, studying the man before her. Lucien turned to face her fully. "I used to think I had to earn love with power," he said. "With money. That if I was successful enough, perfect enough, someone would finally stay." He walked toward her slowly, but didn't sit yet. She didn't. Zarya tilted her head. "Your ex-fiancée?" Lucien nodded once. "Marissa. We were together for 3 years. She was beautiful, or everything my world told me to want. Ivy League, socialite, press perfect. And I treated her like an accessory. I paraded her around, bought her everything she could ask for. Except honesty. Except my heart." His voice cracked a little. "She left because I never really let her in. Because I didn't even know what it meant to love someone. I thought control was for closeness. I thought giving her a penthouse meant I was giving her a piece of me." He finally sat, not beside her, but across, watching her with clear blue eyes. "And then you walked into my office, braids glistening with sunlight, confident, quiet, real. And I forgot everything I believed about love." Zarya's breath hitched. "I didn't want you to see me," he continued, voice barely a whisper. "Not the real me, because if you did, and you left too, I don't know if I'd survive it." For a moment, silence stretched thick between them. Then Zarya spoke, her voice soft, steady. "I've been invisible most of my life." Lucien's eyes snapped to hers. "Not because I was hiding, but because people chose not to see me. Teachers, employers, men." Her fingers tugged the blanket tighter. "I learned to keep my light small, to take up less space, to smile just enough." She swallowed. "But then I walked into your office, and you looked at me like I was light." Lucien leaned forward. "You are." No one ever said that before. They were still, facing each other across a small gap. But the emotional distance between them had vanished completely. Lucien reached out a hand. Zarya didn't hesitate. Their fingers met, and held. "I don't want to lose this," he said. "You don't have to. I don't just want your body, Zarya." "I know," she whispered. "I don't just want your power." He moved beside her now, slow and reverent. She let him. Their bodies didn't tangle like before. They curled into each other like truth finding a home. Lucien laid his head on her lap. She ran her fingers through his dark hair, gentle and calming. He closed his eyes. "I've never felt this safe," he murmured. She smiled softly. "Neither have I." Outside, the storm had passed. The city glimmered under a washed sky, and inside that quiet office, two lovers sat with no armor between them. They didn't make love that night. They didn't need to. They became love, with whispered stories, long silences and shared smiles, with honesty in place of heat, with vulnerability instead of dominance. By the time dawn brushed against the horizon, they were still curled together, no longer boss and employee, not even man and woman. Just two broken, beautiful people finding their way back to wholeness, one truth at a time. Morning didn't rise gently. It struck like a slap. The photograph was everywhere, splashed across gossip blogs, corporate leaks, and whispered between boardroom walls. Zarya, stepping out of Lucian's private office at dawn, her coat barely clinging to her shoulders, braids a little disheveled, eyes half lowered in a glow she couldn't hide. The caption was cruel. CEO's midnight cleaner, the affair that could sink Voss Corp. Lucian stared at the screen, jaw locked. The image stung, but not because of shame. Because they'd stolen something sacred and made it small. His phone exploded. First his assistant, then legal, then the board. Every call was the same. Tell us it's fake. Tell us she seduced you. Tell us it was a mistake. Lucian said nothing. He hung up. Again, and again, and again. But the final call came from the chairman himself. We're not judging you, Lucian, but this affects investors. Stocks are reacting. Clients are whispering. I don't care, Lucian said flatly. You have a company to protect, a brand. This isn't about morality. It's about optics. I won't fire her. You might not have a choice. Then the click. Lucian stood in his office. Same window, same skyline. But the silence now felt like suffocation. He turned toward the door, half expecting her to walk in, joking about the headlines, asking if his face always looked this punchable when scandal hit. But she didn't. Instead, he got something else. A knock. He opened the door. And there she was. Marissa. The past in designer heels and cold perfume. Her smile was poison dipped in pearl gloss. You always did love a good mess. Lucien didn't speak. Marissa stepped inside like she still owned the space. You fell for your maid. Your charity case. He clenched his jaw. Is it rebellion, Lucien? Or do you just get off on being the story for once, instead of writing it? Get out. You know they'll tear her apart, right? She'll be the stain on your clean little empire. I said, but she held up her phone. I already gave them what they needed. Photos, timelines, a sweet little quote. He's always been good at pretending love. Lucien's face turned to stone. You should have married me, she whispered, brushing a finger across his shoulder. At least I knew how to play the game. When she was gone, he stood there in silence. The carpet beneath him blurred. Rage, guilt, panic. Then he noticed the envelope on his desk. Simple, white, unmarked. He opened it. Lucien, I saw the headlines, the photos, the press turning you into the villain they always wanted you to be. And I know what they're saying, what they're demanding, that I'm a liability, a scandal, a mistake. I won't be your ruin, but I will always be your truth. Zarya, the chair behind him, buckled as he dropped into it, holding the note like it might shatter in his hands. She was gone. No goodbye. No confrontation. No accusation. Just love. And sacrifice. He remembered the way she looked when she danced in his office. The way her voice trembled when she said no one had ever seen her before him. The way her hand felt in his. Steady. Anchoring. Real. She had walked away to save him. But he didn't want saving if she wasn't in the future he fought for. He stood. And this time, he didn't reach for control. He reached for truth. It took Lucienne hours to find her, not through spreadsheets or background checks, not through security or leverage, but through memory, through the way she once described her world. Where the skyline meets paint, where little brothers play on stoops and neighbors argue like family. Zaria's world. He stood now at the edge of it, brick buildings, laundry lines, stoops littered with jump ropes and chalk games, the scent of roasting street food and summer rain. Children laughed in the distance, his expensive shoes already stained by city dust. He didn't care. Then he looked up, and there she was, on the rooftop, paintbrush in hand, braids dancing with the breeze. Her canvas was a storm of color, wild, unfiltered, alive, just like her. Lucian's heart clenched at the sight. She was the most breathtaking thing he had ever seen, and this time it had nothing to do with desire. It was devotion, undeniable. Anchoring. He climbed. The stairs were old, creaky. The final door stuck for a second before swinging open. She turned, the brush stilled in her hand. Her eyes widened. Lucienne. He stepped onto the rooftop, chest rising hard. The city roared behind him. But in this space, all he heard was the silence between heartbeats. "I choose you," he said. His voice cracked. "Not the company. Not the board. Not the image they expect. You." She blinked. Once. Twice. "Lucienne, you don't understand." "I do," he cut in. "I understand that they want me to fire you, erase you, pretend you were a mistake. But I've never been more certain of anything." Zaria's lips parted, trembling. "You can't just walk away from $1 billion legacy." He stepped closer. "I can, and I will, if that's what it takes." She narrowed her eyes, not in suspicion, but challenge. "Prove it." Lucienne paused. "How?" Zaria set down her brush, wiped her paint-smudged hands on her jeans. "Spend the day with me. Not as Lucien Voss, the CEO. Not as the man who owns buildings or signs checks. Just a man. Just you." Lucien didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone, typed a quick message to his assistant, and powered it off. "Done," he said. The sun stretched across the sky as she led him through her world, hand in hand, down cracked sidewalks and graffiti alleys, into corner shops where old women called her baby girl and gave him side eyes that made him chuckle. She introduced him to her little brother, who asked if the suit man could play basketball. Lucien lost, badly, and laughed harder than he had in years. They ate street tacos on her stoop, shoulder to shoulder, watching kids run barefoot through sprinklers. He wiped salsa from her lip with his thumb. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just smiled. As dusk settled, she led him back to the rooftop. "I needed to know," she whispered, staring out at the sunset, "that it wasn't about the chase or the fantasy, that if I asked you to step out of your tower, you'd follow." Lucien wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing his forehead to the curve of her shoulder. "I'd burn the tower down if it meant being here with you." She turned to face him. There were no walls now, no titles, no questions, only love. When their lips met, it wasn't fire or thunder. It was a promise. Steady. True. Forever, they stood there as night crept in, surrounded by stars and paint fumes and truth. And this time, the door stayed open.